This may be familiar. Bunch of statistics of dubious utility. Well, this is a bunch of related statistics of similarly dubious utility. In this case, there is no significance to blob size. They are all a dot at the centre of a little crosshair, which may be utterly tasteless, but it does at least make it easy to see where the dot is. And the units are slightly different. Down the left side, we still have 1 pixel per is 1 homicide per 10 million people per year. These numbers are at 100 pixel intervals, and you'll see on the left homicides per 100,000 people per year, which was the actual statistic from gunpolicy.org. Across the top, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70% of households have at least 1 firearm. This is not the percentage of adults living in a household with at least 1 gun, and it is not the number of guns per person, or per 100 people, however you want to phrase it. This is a different statistic for the x-axis, but it is related. It is still prevalence of firearms. It's just by household now rather than by adult or by population. And this is overall homicide rate, not firearm homicide rate. I want to make that clear. This is not shooting deaths. It is not mass shootings. It is not school shootings. It is not murders. It is all homicides. It includes legal intervention ones, which is very significant in the case of New Mexico, which has a ludicrously high number of them. Not shown here. You want that? Look it up yourselves. Anyway, up in the top left we have Japan. Seriously. Just all on its own, with 0.8% or something like that of households have at least 1 firearm, and the murder rate is homicide rate specifically is tiny. And then we have sort of Europe, Estonia is European now, part of the EU. Baltic state and the Baltic nation and the EU state. So there's a state and a nation, and European. Bunch of European places. Hungary kind of stands out among European places as having the highest. Estonia's almost keeping it company, but if you ignore Estonia, Hungary really stands out. Then you have Spain, Italy, Ireland, Germany and Denmark in this dense cluster. And then Austria, France, New Zealand and Canada are kind of near to Austria and France. Then you've got Portugal, Greece, Sweden. I'm mixing Scandinavia in with Europe. Sweden, Iceland, Norway, Switzerland, all the way across here at the 28 point some percent. You'll notice that this whole group, apart from a couple of places like England and Wales, are below 1 homicide per 100,000 people per year. So if somebody tells you, England has really strict gun controls, not compared to Japan, apparently, fairly strict, and they have one of the highest homicide rates in Europe. He's not technically lying to you, but you got to pay attention to that qualifier of in Europe, because of course higher homicide rates below that 1 cut-off, apart from Belgium, Estonia and Hungary, you've got New Zealand and Massachusetts, New Jersey, New York, Rhode Island, Connecticut, Minnesota, Finland, Iowa, New Hampshire, Utah, Washington, Nebraska, Maine, South Dakota, North Dakota, Oregon, Vermont, and all the way across here, Idaho, which has this very high number. Nearly 51% of households have at least 1 firearm, and actually quite a low homicide rate. It's still higher than the UK's, but it's, by American standards, pretty low. There's the USA, that one that's marked USA, centre of the screen there. Quite a bit higher. And coming back across here, you've got this group. Well, it's not much of a group, it's a big spread, but California, Delaware, Illinois are crossing the correlation line, if you like. Maryland, and then you've got Oh, Michigan and Ohio. Are they neighbours? They seem to be pretty much the same place. North Dakota and Oregon. Really not the same place. Different climates, slightly different latitudes. One's coastal, one's continental. Therefore different climates. Ah, very similar numbers. Coming across, Delaware across here and Nevada across here has more than 1.5 times the firearm prevalence by household. A very slightly lower homicide rate. I think it is. Arizona very slightly higher. And across here, West Virginia, again with the huge numbers. West Virginia and Wyoming, huge. Right, 54 to 55% of households having at least one firearm. Homicide rate very similar to Delaware. And then you get, it gets bad with Illinois and Oklahoma and Tennessee and Georgia, and it gets even worse with Maryland, and it gets even worse than that. New Mexico, Missouri, Alaska, South Carolina. Alaska, there's a place that's very different from Missouri. And then Alabama and Louisiana and Mississippi all the way down here. Mississippi is just this kind of outlier. 60-some% of households have at least one firearm. And if you come back across here, you're in the 14 point some. Maybe I should have added the actual numbers as text. I can check. Hold on. Mississippi. 14.52. Apparently the number for Mississippi is 14.52 homicides per 100,000 people per year. Which is kind of scary. And if we come back up to the top left and zoom out like that, you can see this whole group of places from Japan up there in the top left and Mississippi down here in the bottom right, which is Japan with very few guns and very low homicide rate, Mississippi with guns in more than 3/5 of households and a very high homicide rate. And up here you've got Idaho, where there are firearms in just over half of households and a almost European homicide rate, meaning very low by US standards. And there is this line from Japan all the way down to Mississippi, down there. And everywhere is above that, meaning everywhere has fewer homicides than that line. Now, correlation does not imply causation. Obviously, it could be that many households have guns because there is such a high homicide rate, or that there is such a high homicide rate because many households have guns, or something else could be causing both of those, or it could just be coincidence. But it's a heck of a big data pool at this point. Hundreds of millions of people. And of course, before you go asserting, look, Japan down to Mississippi, a line, and everywhere has fewer homicides than that line, of course there has to be somewhere that's going to spoil it. That was way too much zoom. That much zoom should be good. Yep, DC. DC is there to spoil it. There's Mississippi on the right, and there's DC. 14? Yeah, more like 23 there. And just for the sake of context, there's South Africa. So if you're in the USA and you're thinking about policy and what policy to write or what policy to propose or how to vote on a policy or which politicians to propose to support, maybe you ought to be looking at, if you don't want to reduce the number of guns, maybe you ought to be looking at what's different between, say, Maine and Vermont and New Mexico and Missouri, because they have very similar guns per household, very different homicide rates? Or how does Idaho differ from South Carolina and Alaska? Why is Idaho better? Why is Wyoming doing so much better than Louisiana? Or you could look diagonally. You could compare, say, Finland to Illinois. How come Finland manages to have, what's that? That's about a quarter, about a fifth more guns, more higher proportion of households that have at least one firearm, not actually more guns, than Illinois, and a much lower homicide rate. Make the same comparison Vermont versus Maryland, or Idaho versus New Mexico. Or if you're, if you're in Massachusetts and you think having fewer guns isn't the answer, but you do want a lower homicide rate, take a look at, Switzerland, Massachusetts, New Jersey, New York, Rhode Island, Connecticut, Switzerland. It's more likely to have a gun in the house in Switzerland than in any of those states, and yet somehow far lower homicide rate. Likewise, Norway. Or if you don't fancy Switzerland, well, there's Italy, which has almost as many guns as Massachusetts. Almost as many households have guns as in Massachusetts. Far lower homicide rate. Very similar to Switzerland. Also, fabulous clothing, fabulous food, fabulous ladies, very low abortion rate, very low teenage birth rate, very low obesity rate, good life expectancy, very low traffic accident fatality rate, lower asthma rate, cleaner air, beautiful landscapes. You can't really do much about the beautiful landscapes part, but maybe you could try importing some of the Italian way of life that has allowed them to have, those other advantages over you. Or French, if you're more into French than Italian. Or Spanish. Slightly fewer guns and higher homicide rate in Spain, but not much. Of course, England and Wales isn't looking as good here. If you go by just firearm homicides, England and Wales does look quite good because there are very few of them, but the overall homicide rate is a bit higher. And Estonia, well, maybe not Estonia. Oh, here's one to look at. Look at Hungary, because it's technically in Europe. Greece is over here with way more guns and far lower homicide rate. How does Hungary differ from Spain or Italy or Germany? What do people have in Hungary that they don't have in Spain? Or what do people have in Germany that they don't have in Hungary? Social safety nets? Socialised healthcare? Shelters for the homeless? Universal basic income? Universal access to healthcare? Free education up to the age of 18? Up to the age of 21 maybe? Something about racism? Trans rights? I don't know. Take a look into it. Take a look at temperature. Finland probably gets pretty warm, but not really heat stroke city. Pennsylvania, maybe it gets hotter. Then again, does Alaska get all that hot? It's way down here, not looking so good. Could it be humidity? Louisiana and Mississippi are kind of famous for it. But New Mexico, it's a desert. Maybe it's religion. Think of somewhere really religious, like Utah and Idaho. Lots of religion, relatively low homicide rates. And Alabama, lots of religion, relatively high homicide rate. Oh, right. Red state versus blue state, maybe? You know, Idaho, famously one of them. Maine, famously the same one. Vermont, consistently the same party as Iowa. Or not, as the case may be. But maybe, just maybe, if you're living somewhere out here in this dangerous bottom right corner, or just along the dangerous bottom edge, or, you know, let's just say, actually, England and Wales just off the top there, and just scroll across and say if your state, your home state, try to scroll nearly horizontally, appears anywhere on here, or down here, or down there, maybe you ought to look into trying to get more like these places in this very top strip, the places that weren't on the screen then, like Japan and the Netherlands, the Czech Republic and Scotland and Spain and Italy and Norway and Switzerland, places where that, how would you describe it? The freedom to send your kids off to school in the morning, fully expecting them to come back alive later the same day. Maybe you ought to just try to be more like those places. It's just a thought. You'll have a nice day.